Hi, welcome to the cottage. We are a lively outpouring of an exciting adventure into God's riches, glories in Christ Jesus. We regularly work to activate an excitement for the kingdom of God as it is in the now until it comes into its fullness. We invite you to our sessions to explore the heights and depths of God's love in a fuller bandwidth. I'm Dr. Ken, the pastor of a small independent church seeking to return to the Lord's zeal in times where apathy and lethargy rule the day of the complacent. We try to shake things up and offer a temporary home as we travel this sod until we reach higher ground and connect into the everlasting life from above, here on the earth as it is in heaven. For more information, you can email us at thecottage@dken.cc. That is thecottage@dken.cc. To see the sermon slides, you must use the Spotify app. They will appear in a video.
Hi, welcome back to the cottage. In this episode, we continue our series from the Bible Project on the book of Exodus. And we're tracking that theme, and we're still in the Gospels. And we're just going to enter into understanding what took place on the Mount of Transfiguration and how Jesus uses that to then empower us to be the church. Well, we're in our series on the theme of Exodus, and we're in the Gospels. We're following the Bible Project in the Exodus way. It's the way out, the way between, and the way in. And we're just going across this theme in the Gospels, and we've been wrapping up with earlier. We looked at the theme of Isaiah's new Exodus in the Gospels, and John the Baptist leading as the preparing the way for God to come in Jesus Christ in the flesh, where he talked about, incidentally, back in chapter 35, Isaiah, the highway of holiness. That's what we talked about. And that on that road, the redeemed shall walk, but there will not be any evil found therein. And that's going to be important for what we're going to get into today. And then we moved into the Gospels in Matthew 9, where we talked about whole salvation and that Jesus makes everyone whole. And the woman with the issue of blood was made whole. And we showed you the Bible Project video about how when Jesus comes into contact with an unclean person, the unclean person is no longer clean, uncontaminating them, cleansing them. And so contact with Christ is cleansing, where a normal person would come into contact with an unclean person would themselves become unclean. We saw that in The Chosen when we watched that episode where Jesus healed this woman, and then the leaders of the made him, after the raising of Jairus' daughter, to go wash in the sea, although that was not needed. And Jesus is trying to help them understand whole salvation, because the word whole in this passage in Matthew 9:21 and 22 is the word whole is sozo, from which we get the word save or salvation. And, that's tied to Jesus' name. Jesus comes to us anglicized from the German, which incidentally has no j sound, no soft G, but their J's are pronounced like the Y, coming from the Hebrew, actually, and then the Greek, and then you have the Latin, and then Luther bringing in the German, and then we bring in English, it becomes Jesus. But that G part is yea, for Yahweh, God saves. Yahweh saves, and that's sozo, thus, sozo in the Greek. And so what we have in Matthew chapter 16 is that Jesus takes them, and you remember we saw this in The Chosen, where after John the Baptist dies, Jesus takes them to Caesarea Philippi, and there's a special temple there that all the Greeks had set up, and then Rome followed suit, and they worshiped all the gods there. And it's at the base of the mountain range where Mount Hermon is found, and that's where the ancient Near Eastern people believed the council of the gods were. And so it's kind of the headquarters of all evil, of all the spirits there. And at this place was actually, and you saw it in The Chosen, they referred to it, there's a cave there at those temples, and it was a bottomless pit. And geographically, there was a pit there, and they would throw things in the pit and never hear bottom. never hear a splash or anything. And they call it the bottomless pit. And that's where we get that. And Jesus takes them to this place. And he says, what are people saying about me? Of course, people are talking about, and we talked about why John the Baptist was named John. And then we talked about why the baptizer, why he had to baptize Jesus. And so people are asking who he is. Of course, Herod and others think that maybe it's John the Baptist's ghost that has then come reincarnated in another person, taking on that spirit, as John's spirit is restless, having suffered such an end and unjustly, and so his ghost is about in another person, plaguing them. And some thought it was Elijah. The King James has Elias or Jeremiah, one of the prophets, and he's saying, but who do you say I am? And when we look at the ESV, it helps clear up the King James for us, and it's Elijah, so that we can understand that. Going on then from Matthew 16:14, we're in chapter 16, verse 16, where Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. In his response, when Jesus says, well, who do they say that I am? And who does the world say that Jesus is? And then, who do you say I am? And he said, this has not been revealed to you by flesh and blood, Simon, son of John, but this has been revealed to you by my Father in heaven. And then he's standing at that place, and he says, upon this very rock, thou art Peter, and I will build my church. And Jesus chooses to build his church upon his disciples, upon his followers. We are a result of what Christ was building, with Peter being part of those living stones that Peter talks about, the church. And so Jesus builds his church right there at the gates of, the King James says, hell itself. And of course, this whole language then in the Aramaic and in the Greek is a play on words, because Peter, or Cephas, means stone, and then upon this rock. You are a stone, and upon this rock I'm going to build my church. And so we get this language of Petros and Petra, and the whole unveiling of that. But it's actually, as we look at the New English translation of verse 18 of Matthew 16, it's the gates of Hades, and among other translations we'll have this as well for us, where they transliterate the Greek. And so the King James transliterates these Greek places to be hell, but this is Hades, the place of the dead, equated with Sheol in the Old Testament. And this is actually that bottomless pit. They thought they were at the very gates of hell itself. And so he's at that place, and incidentally, and in that location, in that vicinity, and he's headed toward, in Matthew 17, to a high place, which right there in that vicinity would be Mount Hermon. It's the highest mountain in the region. The entire biblical lands, it's the highest mountain. It's not the highest in the world, obviously. That would be Kathmandu, Nepal, where Alicia's from, out into the Himalayan mountains, Mount Everest. So that kind of thing. But it is the highest in the biblical lands. And that's where the ancient Near Easterns believed that the gods had held council, and they had their high meeting place. And he takes them to that place. He takes Peter, James, and his brother John, and takes them to that high mountain, and he's transfigured for them as God. He's transfigured as the light of the world. He's getting the glory from Eden that's returned to him, and his raiment is white, the light. Okay, and so he has this wonderful radiance about him, where he is shining. And there he meets, in Matthew 17, 3 and 4, Moses and Elijah, who represent the law and the prophets, and also those who had been on mountains before. So remember that Moses was taking the people at Mount Sinai, that at the burning bush, when God first spoke to Moses, the first sign he gave them was what? That he was going to do what? That he was going to bring the people back, and they were to worship him on that mountain. And that's what they were to do. And so Moses did bring the people back, and they worshiped God on Mount Sinai. And we remember that. And then Elijah had his own mountaintop experience, where first he brought the people and asked them whom they will serve, whether they were going to serve How long will you halt between the two opinions? Are you going to serve these ancient Near Eastern gods and let them be your boss and rule over you, as we've been talking about in our series on Ephesians 3 and the principalities and powers on Sundays? Who is going to rule over you? We've been talking about them. And so how long are you going to halt between two opinions? Who's going to rule over you? That's what we were talking about then. Okay, and so then Elijah finds himself also in the same mountain range as Moses, and he's calling out to God, and hears the still small voice. All of that's in 1 Kings 18 and 19. So both have their mountaintop experiences, and they're there with Jesus, and they're talking about things concerning to Jesus' crucifixion, and it's going to be interesting how that's going to play about in our next session. We'll come back to these two in our next session. Peter wants to make this a holy site, and something else happens. And surprise, while Peter is speaking and wants to build his monument, behold, a bright light overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him." And God himself speaks. And when God speaks, when the disciples heard it, they fell on their face, and they're so afraid. And anyone who's encountered God in the Bible usually has this reverence, and they usually are deeply afraid, and they end up prostrating themselves because of his holiness, which is not how God is often described today when people have encounters with God. They may describe it differently, and I cannot discern at this moment whether they're actually experiencing God or not. We all experience God in our own ways as we walk about, but to have heard the direct voice of God, yes, that puts them on their face. And Jesus says, "Don't be afraid." And when they looked up their lives, they saw no one. When they looked up their eyes, they saw no one except Jesus only. So and it's interesting, they didn't see a man here except for Jesus, but in a sense that Jesus is God. So it's interesting that he's there alone with them now, and they are catching this whole moment up. This reminds us of another serpent that we've been talking about, and that's that the Garden of Eden. There was the creature that we know as the serpent, that's talked about in Ezekiel chapter 28 verse 13. And he's also dressed in radiant garments. And yeah, he was the guardian cherub, it says in verse 14 of Ezekiel 28. And he was God's personal entourage, his bodyguard, his chief bodyguard. And so he's an anointed cherub. He's the chosen one that was supposed to cover and protect, the Secret Service protects the President of the United States. And here he is, and he should be someone held in confidence. And he's in Eden, but he's on a mountain. So Eden is described as this place where heaven and earth meet, and mountain where earth and sky, land and sky, the heavens touch. And he walked up and down those. And of course, he walked in the garden. And of course, he then decided that, hey, listen, I am not going to worship this piece of mud. I'm not taking this Play-Doh and bowing down to it just because you breathe your life into it. And you're going to put them in charge of the new realm and the new kingdom, and you're not going to put me in charge. And so he was having nothing to do with it. And so you have this same thing where Satan becomes the god of this world when he deceives Adam and Eve, and now he's ruling from Mount Hermon. He's ruling from this mountain, and it's at the very gates of Hades itself that he's ruling. And now Jesus is saying that he's given the keys of the kingdom to these fishermen, and instead of calling in legions of angels on the cross, he's going to take the keys of the kingdom and give them to his disciples. And they are the church, and they have the authority. And that's what we've been talking largely about in our Ephesians 3 series during the Sunday main worship in our sermons, about how this transpires. And so you have this going back to the Moses now. He's meeting with Moses. And so the thought of the reader is they understand what happened when Moses went on the mountain. And now Moses is back on the mountain. So when Moses went up on the mountain in Exodus chapter 20, we know that he's fulfilling what God told him in Exodus 3. when you brought them out, you bring them here to serve me on this mountain. Following the language of what we're studying again in Ephesians as we work through these passages, 2 Peter last week, that we talk about whom you serving, who's your master, what masters you. And so he gives the 10 Commandments and says, you'll have no other gods before me. You'll have no idols. You're going to serve me and me alone because, I'm going to be the only God that you serve. There are many spirits in this world, but I'm going to be the one and only for you. And when they hear the Big Ten, the 10 words the Jews call it, when they hear the 10 Commandments, what we call it, they were so afraid. and they stood afar off. And they said to Moses, we're going to hire you as our first pastor. You go find out what God wants, and then you come tell us what he wants because we're afraid to die. Again, the people are afraid. But Moses is saying, no, you don't have to be afraid. You can come. In Exodus 20 verses 20 and 21. You don't have to be afraid. Fear not. God has come to show you that, and he's put the fear so that you will not sin and that you can enter in. Sin not so that you can enter in. But yet the people still stood afar off, and Moses is going to then draw closer. It's interesting. It mentions that Moses goes through the darkness to get to God, and oftentimes that's where we find God in the darkest places of our lives, where when they're steeped in the battle of spiritual warfare and the powers of darkness. And here at the death of John the Baptist, the disciples are like, why in the world, when your cousin dies, your predecessor, the one who was brought to come before you, and he dies, and then he's beheaded, that you take us to, of all places, to the gates of hell itself. And maybe he's like telling Satan, hey, you think you got my cousin down there? You got another thing coming because I've come to get him. But anyway, he is laying it down for the powers of darkness and saying, hit me with your best shot. Fire away. And so here Moses is going through the darkness and choosing God. And it's, again, whatever masters you, or you're going to walk in the Spirit, whatever is going to govern you. As Satan walked about the Garden of Eden upon the mountain of God, we're supposed to, according to Galatians 5:25, walk in according after the Spirit. And so we have a choice to make here. What's going to master us? And so Moses said, choose God, and the people instead send Moses up. And he chooses what instead? What does he choose? He goes up and he's with God, and what do the people choose? They choose the golden calf. And so you have this juxtaposition of the chance for either which mountain and who's going to rule. And when Satan calls Jesus to probably the same mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the world and says, these are mine, probably from Mount Hermon, because that's the headquarters in the ancient world of all the powers of darkness. And he's probably saying, I'm the head here, and I'm over it all, and here you go, I'll give it to you. Just bow down and worship me. And she's like, I ain't having any part of this. I'm not having any part of this. No, I'm going to take it from you, and I'm going to use my fishermen. Jesus could have called legions of angels, but he called us. He called us, and he chooses us. And the potter chooses us as his clay, and he's going to fill us with his glory, and he's going to fill the whole earth, every clay vessel, he's going to fill with his glory. And so here you have the tale of two mountains. Instead of Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, and instead of, the Tolkien's Two Towers, we have the tale of the two mountains. And you have Moses drawing near to God, and that's what Jesus is inviting his disciples to do, and yet they're standing afar off. And look how many people stood far off from Christ. And even though he came and they expected him to overthrow the Romans, what he was doing is trying to draw people near to God by drawing people near to him and showing them the way to the Father. And instead of fighting the Romans, he was saying, hey, I don't want you to fight Romans. I want you to draw close to God. And it all goes back then again to Exodus chapter 24, where again, that's where he's at. And Moses is there, and he's on the mount, and then he introduces the eldership and all the people, and the priest to God. They eat with God, and he goes up, and then he goes on up higher, and he ascends, and they still want to stay afar off. And so, just as Jesus made the ascent and only took his 3 disciples that he had close confidence with, Moses then goes up into the mount, and the glory cloud covered the mount, and the glory of the Lord abode upon Mount Sinai. We're in Exodus 24, verses 15, 16, and 17. And there was the glory, and it covered it for 6 days. And the 7th day he called unto Moses out of the midst of the cloud, and the sight of the glory of the Lord was like an all-consuming fire, devouring fire, on the top of the mountain in the eyes of the children of Israel, and they were like, we ain't having anything of it. And then 40 days later, they're dancing naked, drunk as a skunk, before a golden calf, and they think Moses has died because they don't get it. They don't understand the intimacy that Moses is offering. And Jesus is offering the same thing, and he's given the keys of the kingdom over to these fishermen, to Peter, James, and John. And he's saying that, listen, the way that I'm going is the way of the cross, and I'm going to take you to the highway of holiness, and you can go to the very gates of hell itself. It will not prevail. Isaiah 35, those beasts will not be there, because I am going to take them on. I'm going to throw down the gauntlet, and I'm going to stand in their face, knock on their front door, and tell them, I'm here. What are you going to do about it? I'm throwing it down. What are you going to do? It's high noon, and I'm here, and it's ready. Draw your pistol and hit me with your best shot. And so that's exactly what happens. From this point, Jesus is going to, as we mapped it out, when we mapped Easter out, Jesus is going to follow the same trajectory as Joshua did when he defeated the giant kings that were of this region, that served these gods. And Joshua defeated them. The physical Joshua defeated them, and they believe from these giants came the spirits. The Jews believe those spirits became, their dead spirits became the demons that Jesus then is dealing with in the New Testament. That's how the Jews understood it in their Second Temple literature. And that's how most Jews probably would have understood it in the day, from the literature that we have that has survived and passed down to us. And so Jesus is throwing down the gauntlet, and he's telling them, listen, your day's over. Just like we said in Ephesians 3:10, he's going to make manifest through the church, and he hands the keys to the church, and he says, listen, you have power to go into a village and preach the gospel to a woman and get her saved, and she no longer worships pagan gods and idols, and she is set free, and free indeed. And so we have this amazing layout of how this all comes about, and how people are set free. And I'm reminded when the woman with the issue of blood, that today, even in Nepal, they still have these practices where women who experience their monthly cycle have to then go off on their own, and they have to sit by themselves because they're unclean. And they have the same purity laws in their religion that they passed down from the original laws that were given. And they have these same practices, and these women are vulnerable, and they're to be kept, and it's terrible. And then they can be spending the night by themselves in the cold. They can be spending themselves in the night and, just in a terrible place where the wildlife can get to them, where other men can do things to them that they shouldn't. And Jesus says, listen, I am going to make the way where you no longer have to be treated like that you are no longer unclean, that you are made right, that I'm going to cleanse you of these predicaments. I'm going to save you. So Jesus saves us from our sins, but he also saves us from these things that separate us. And this woman she's a woman, so she's not highly recognized in the ancient world as a woman. And then she's not recognized because she's unclean, just like these Nepali women when they have to go off on their own because they have, had their monthly and they're unclean, and then they're vulnerable to the elements, they're vulnerable to the wildlife, they're vulnerable to other men who get drunk and do things and they shouldn't, and they're vulnerable, and women have died because of the fire smoke that went from the main house into where they were staying, the room they were staying, and they died because of poor ventilation. I mean, it's just terrible, the things that they have had to endure simply because of a natural process of life. And so Jesus has come even today and says, no, that's not the right understanding, that God wants to make people whole, not separate them away. And so he's come to give life. But you can't be in the presence of God with sin. And so they misunderstand. And because of those misunderstandings, then we have this situation where people are not whole and they're not right. And so Jesus comes to rectify all those injustices, all those sins. At the same time, he then says, you will not be also afflicted by these evil spirits and these powers. They don't have any power over you whatsoever. And so when you're dealing with understanding the whole idea of wholeness to the woman with the issue of blood, and you understand the whole idea of salvation from sin and deliverance, but also from the deliverance from the powers of darkness, that you can go into a village and preach the gospel to them and set them free. And so that's the power of God that sets us free from these other powers. You don't have to serve them anymore. They won't control you anymore. And so this is what's behind it. And just as God was just trying to show the leadership, and through Moses in Exodus 24, from which Jesus cites at the Lord's Supper, and then he then gives the keys to the disciples, the keys of the kingdom, to them, and says, you're my church, and I'm going to manifest through you, the church, to the principalities and powers, that their day is over, and that the people are saved, and I'm going to make them whole, even the Gentile. I'm going to make them whole. And so Elijah and Moses had their mountain experiences. Jesus taught the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus fed the manna. It's just all the things that Jesus did, and Moses did the manna, and then Elijah even had the widow woman with her bread of life that lasted through the drought. It's just amazing the correlations between all of these, that Jesus is doing so much more, and he's doing it so much better, and he is bringing about the salvation that is started in the theme strongly in our series here about Exodus, but it goes all the way back to the beginning. And we're going to continue understanding how that all ties to the Exodus next week. We hope you've enjoyed this, and we hope you'll enjoy our sermon out of Ephesians 3:10 on the principalities and powers, where we dig more into this, and we go to Romans chapter 8, verse 12 to unpack that further, in understanding that we are debtors, but to whom are we indebted?
We hope you enjoyed this broadcast. You can find out more about us at dken.cc. That's dken.cc. We look forward to seeing you next time. God bless you.